James Voorhies is currently curator at large at the Bass Museum of Art in Miami Beach. He served as director of the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard, dean of fine arts at the California College of the Arts, and executive director of the Tony Smith Foundation. He's the author of quite an extraordinary number of books. We were just looking, and I think James will share, or I hope you're going to share that image just of the page of books.
Yeah.
Um, but recently, he's the author of Postsensual Aesthetics on the Logic of the Curatorial that came out in 2023 from MIT, and Beyond Objecthood, the exhibition as a critical form since 1968, also from MIT in 2017, and the editor of the four-volume catalog raisonné of Tony Smith, which launched, the book launch was last night, and MIT has brought that out as well. So with that, I will turn things over to you, James. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. And also, I really appreciate the format of sort of just going through different projects that I've made. And also, it offered an opportunity to, really think about some of the through lines that connect the different writing and curatorial practices that I have. You asked me to just give a few words about how I arrived at as a curator and a writer, and I studied art history at The Ohio State University. I have my master's and my PhD from OSU, and in the early days, I worked as a curatorial assistant in the Brooklyn Museum, and then later as a collections manager at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then before working on my PhD, I worked with Ralph Rugoff at the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco. And actually it was in mid-30s, so a little later in life, went back and worked and finished the PhD at OSU while I was director of exhibitions at Columbus College of Art. And that was a really incredible experience and very fruitful to be studying while also making exhibitions. And there was a really rich dialogue between the academic and the practicalities of just putting together projects that fueled a lot of my interest. The 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 things that like my book Beyond Objecthood, the exhibition as a critical form, here are the books. This came out of the PhD thesis, and I think it speaks a lot to the initial interest in which I think is one of the through lines that we'll like find here in some of the projects, is just really the power of curating and different curatorial methodologies for coming to and arriving at the ideas and knowledge that art has to offer. And this book, actually, even before I started working at the Tony Smith Foundation, it uses the famous story that Tony Smith offers in the 50s, taking his students along the unmarked New Jersey Turnpike and really having a number of questions about the power of the static object, and that he, in an interview with Samuel Wagstaff, talks about that art is something that you just have to experience it. And this book makes a case for curatorial methodologies that begin with Robert Smithson and the compositional nature of like photographs and sculpture that are placed inside that require looking and thinking and moving to arrive at the art object. And in this case, for Smithson, they were the non-sites. And that same interest in curatorial methodologies was taken even further when thinking about the role of the archive. Postsensual Aesthetics on the Logic of the Curatorial, which you mentioned, came out a couple years ago. And this book was a response to the increasing number of archival materials and text that are integral to an exhibition or a work of art. And usually the texts and the reading materials come out of the need to reveal research that doesn't take a visual aesthetics, but still becomes part of thinking around an exhibition. So one of the examples I use is German artist Maria Eichhorn, who's done considerable research on the looting of art and the return of that, and her research, especially in recent documenta, was integral to the exhibition. Another example I used, Caroline Krischow-Backer. She has 100 notes, 100 thoughts that were part of her documenta. And so before I get into the projects, I guess these are the underlying interests: is how can like design and these compositional ways of coming at exhibition making and some artwork reveal a number of the knowledge and history that the work is attempting to do. So that's on one hand like a research and interest of mine, but recent projects, they don't always sort of illustrate that literally. As you said, I'm the curator at large at the Bass, and I've had the really wonderful opportunity for almost the last 3 years to make exhibitions there. And when I arrived at the Bass, we started just thinking about how important Miami and Miami Beach was for a number of artists who had spent time in the city and who had either lived there for a number of years or spent, a few months or years there. And the museum had just purchased a work by Namjoon Paik, one of his TV cellos. And I wanted to make an exhibition that introduced the TV cello and started looking and we realized, of course, we knew that Pike passed in Miami Beach in 2006. And that seemed interesting and a little odd to me, being that he was mostly based in New York, but also an incredible itinerant artist. And so through a lot of research, he learned that in the 80s, he actually spent a considerable amount of time. Miami Beach had a really vibrant, sorry, let me slow down here, this video scene. And oops, I'm sorry. There we go. There we go. Had a really vibrant video scene in the 80s, and they had a very strong public art project. And Pike was invited to create two large-scale installations for the Miami International Airport. And throughout the late 80s, those works were worked on and finally came to be realized around 1990. This is a photo of the TV cello that is in the Bass's collection. And so this ended up being a really interesting project because it was a bit of a blind spot in the Pike literature that very few people knew about the airport projects. They haven't appeared much in the literature around Pike. John Hanhart, who's a premier Pike scholar, was generous in conversation with us during the whole process of organizing this exhibition. And so Namjoon Paik, the Miami years, through basically they're a selection of archival material, and through these large scale photostats, this is the work that many people encountered when they would come through the Miami International Airport in the early 1990s, one of them. And it is actually one of the very few photographs that exist of this work. And we I worked to like delve through the archive, pull up these from the borrow these photographs from the Pike estate of Pike in Miami, some of his drawings and newspaper articles that I sifted through all the different library resources in Miami to bring this John. We invited him down to 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 uh, to basically animate this history through this archival material, and it ended up being a really wonderful project. Because we also this shows here a very bad photograph of but the all the different video that Pike captured in order to put into his work called Miami TV Miami. And um, so this is one way where, in one hand, we could have shown the TV cello, but we really tried to create this sort of jewel box project that used design, this incredible photograph by Brian Smith that was taken for the Miami Times when Pike's project was released in the early 90s, and sort of make a lot out of what could have potentially been a much simpler installation. And these were different ways with the archival of reading that we arrived at, essentially educating the public about this really particular history that also includes this little booklet that we made and that I really was really important to me to have as a free giveaway that basically expands on everything that I just talked about, including the TV cello. And and so that is the first iteration of the Miami years. And it was really important for me, it is important at the BAS to create projects that speak much more globally and internationally, but also, draw on this locality. And so the second edition of the Miami years, Rachel Feinstein, the Miami years. And this ended up, Rachel Feinstein is a New York-based artist. She's born in Arizona, but she spent most of her formative years until she was around 19 or 20 when she took off to New York to go to Columbia. She spent her time in Miami Beach or in Miami, and this ended up being, whereas like Pike, he had about 20 years. He ended up buying an apartment and passing in Miami Beach. Um, they were very delineated. The research and work we did around this exhibition revealed that the conflation of aesthetic styles, the interest in architecture and design, and sort of the questions around, especially female identity and gender, were Rachel's time growing up in Miami. Was really influential on her aesthetic practice that continues to linger today. And one of the things with contemporary artists that we do, which is to offer different opportunities for commissioned projects. And so this exhibition, which is currently up, ended up being a very special project because it brings together over 30 years of artworks, many objects by Rachel, that have not been seen for decades. And it is, while I wouldn't say it's a survey, it's a very concise summary of of her work and her different interests. In the theatrical, this work here is a series from her secrets based on Victoria's Secret models, and kind of like a monstrosity of version of that portrayal of female identity. And and then also she works in these different like theatrical flats, and but the kind of like major piece is a 5 panel piece called Panorama of Miami that we commissioned, and that is, 60 inches by 72 inches. And it's essentially a narrative of her different interests and points in Miami, from the Serpentarium to the Bass to the different hotels that influenced her growing up. And so this is another sort of instance of just like where the it's specific to Miami, but it also really reveals the internationalism of Miami. It's the clear impact on the thinking of this artist, Rachel Feinstein. One of the things is important is looking at the institution for me also as a kind of curated thing. And so we we initiated a conversation with Rachel and saw that these elements of the performance and the theatrical were really important to her practice. And so the season, which opened last year, was all these different ways of coming to performance and the theatrical. And this was a really exciting project. Here is the reinstallation of the permanent collection. The Bass's permanent collection is really incredible. They have a number of historical works by figures such as Francesco Botticini. They have work by Michel van Muscher, Jan Wienix, the paintings by the workshop of Anthony van Dyck. And I really love this because it is a museum collection that was developed from a very personal perspective of John and Joanna Bass, and a few works still remain from that collection, and they serve as really wonderful foils in this exhibition that we organize called Performing Perspectives. And we worked with the team, Sofia Dota, who's the Associate Director of Exhibitions, and Claudia Matos, who is the Associate Curator of New Media Art. And the three of us really looked at the selection of works that could come out as part of this exhibition, but even more importantly, design. And this is where, like, I think both design and curatorial methodologies that include the juxtaposition of works of art and really taking into account the different through lines can essentially animate historical works like a painting by Botticini. When, for example, self-portrait is paired with in the same sight line as a large self-portrait of by Alex Israel. And this exhibition is divided into three different sections that also look at the different way of, like, for example, this one's called The Indexicality of Performance, and it's centers around a recent gift by Ellen Harvey of where she repainted different of paintings in the Bass's collection, now well over, like, I think 15 years ago, of the different nudes. And that's juxtaposed in the same space with a recent gift of a work by Francesca Di Matteo, a huge chandelier made of different porcelain pieces that look at femininity from that point of view. And here you can see, like, this is a one of the Pike pieces that we have on long-term loan there, called Lucy, a different portrait form that was juxtaposed there. In the distance there, that's a work by Nan Golden. So this exhibition has really, offered, here's some different stills. It demonstrates, I think, these ways that curating and juxtaposition and lending people kind of as an aesthetic, sort of nudge, and then they find their own way through it. And it's been really rewarding to see and have responses because people see the juxtapositions of them with the Bernice Abbotts here, different documentary photographs of people in New York and other luminaries like James Joyce, and juxtaposed here with a little small book by Andy Warhol, also of people in his coterie. So that is also currently installed. And then Ulla von Brandenburg is a German artist based in Paris. This project is also a different way of sort of looking at and arriving at bringing knowledge out about a collection in the archive. In 2000, I think 22, the Bass purchased this incredible mural by Attila Nan, which is the only ceramic mural of this size that's in a collection in the United States, a museum in the United States, and it's based on a sketch from a few years earlier, just before Nan passed. And we introduced this the first year I was there, like 3 years ago, of looking at Attila Nan's interest in architecture and design. And although she's known as a painter, she had a number of interests in the power of public space and the politics of public space, and design. And this exhibition was an invitation to Ulla to essentially think about Attila Nan's work, and Ulla proposed that of making this curtain, because Ulla's also works a lot in the expansive power of abstraction that can filter into different parts of architectural settings and the theatrical. She's designed theatrical sets and so forth. And this curtain, I'll show you a better picture of it, is based on a drawing that she made that is based on putting the visual essentially to the sound of a piano composition. And then she's enlarged that into a curtain that is seen from below before visitors even come up to the second floor. And so visually they're sort of solicited to come up the stairs. And then this component serves as a kind of theatrical entrance into the Attila Nan space. And this ended up being, was a really amazing project that evolved over months with Ulla and Sophia and Claudia. And of course, like ideas shaped and shifted. And we also arrived at including this video, three-part video by Ulla that is about Sonia Delaunay. So without really setting out to make this exact exhibition, what we ended up is with 3 generations of artists: Ulla von Brandenburg, Attila Nan, and Sonia Delaunay, who have really experimented with the expansive power of abstraction to enter into many facets of daily life and the built environment. And of course, then this element of the theatrical is part of this as well. So that is also currently on at the Bass. And so when thinking about these, so these are the 3 exhibitions, and then I had been in Berlin at the Julius Stoschek Foundation 2 springs ago, and Lisa Long had curated a survey of work on La Orda. It was a collective that is based in Marseille. They're actually the artistic directors of the Marseille Ballet, and it was one of those situations where I was really just stopped in my tracks as I left because of this exhibition called Bondi this video called Bondi. And it's a short, like 16-minute video that is based on a compilation of video that is shot by the residents, mostly the residents of the city of Bondy, which is a suburb just outside of Paris. And it they solicited people to send in components of their video of different swimming, and there's a motorcycle club that exists there. And then also different YouTube videos of dance and performance, and they compiled and edited these clips. And it's a really incredibly magical video because Bondi is a very diverse city, but it shows sort of the harmonious way that people can move through and exist together in public space and private space. And it in the kind of composition of the Bass's season programming with these four. All the exhibitions serve as a different kind of node. This is a much larger exhibition, and none of them are less valuable than the others. But this is a really wonderful punctuation that arrives at performance and the theatrical from a different point of view, and also I think has the potential to leave visitors on a higher note because of just how gorgeous the video is. So even at the Carpenter Center, like earlier, we don't have time to go into all of this, but like it's always been important of how to look at the correspondences among the exhibitions and the activities. And well, I guess I can talk about this is here. And one of those ways I did that even at the Carpenter Center was like I curated something called Phil Collins, a learning site. Um, this is a artist who's based in Berlin, Phil Collins, and this was something I made while I was director of the Carpenter Center, and while I was also teaching in the visual and film department at Harvard. And we presented, on one hand, any viewer, any visitor during open hours could come to the center, and they would be able to see an installation of one of Phil's film called The Meaning of Style. And but the whole season came at Phil Collins and the concept from many different points of view. We spent I collaborated with the Harvard Film Archive, and we ended up showing every one of Phil's films as part of the season that year in the archive. Um, I constructed a seminar around his course with my students, looking at the different questions that Phil's practice asks in terms of soliciting participation from different communities. For example, in one of his videos called The World Won't Listen. And as part of the class, we held something called open seminars, Phil Collins in Context. And this was essentially a way that those really wonderful private um, conversations that happen in closed seminars, every once in a while during the spring season, came to the public realm. And this part of the requirements of the students was to host these talks and to moderate the talks and during class time. So we essentially created an open learning site around Phil Collins and would screen different parts of his films and discuss some of the pointed questions that his practice asks. On top of that, we had Phil come and give a talk and a screening with one of his newer films at that time called Tomorrow is Always Too Long. Um, these are some of the other films we showed. This is the bookshop, because I was running a bookshop also at the Carpenter Center at that time. And oh yeah, we made different bookmarks that called quotes from, oh, there's Maria Len's quotes from different sources of books that we had read, and these were available for free at the bookshop. They were in a series of like 15. Um, This is from the screening at the Harvard Film Archive. Look how beautiful that is. talk afterwards with him. And then he visited this the seminar that I was teaching the students, other stills. And then he also he we have something called a cert practitioner residency, and it's a way to bring an artist in and and bring an artist in, and they essentially work on a project with students. And he worked with students in the Harvard Radio broadcast channel to look at the different ways in which, ideas could be broadcast by students. And that was also just another way of getting at him. Here's the picture of the bookshop that I ran. So I guess this is also, like, in terms of a curated thing, there are many ways of coming to and around Phil Collins and the important questions that his art asks. And it isn't for me like meaning that using curatorial methodologies to get at how we understand or anything, but it's like using curatorial methodologies to pull out the ideas that art has to offer. And a curated exhibition is one thing inside a space, the juxtaposition of works, but I also really value the concerted different events and gatherings, small and large, private and public, that essentially get at an artist's work. And I loved putting together the Phil Collins, the learning site. It was really lovely as a constellation of activities um, for that. So that's that. Going back, let's look at time. I'm going to be conscious of time here and see. Um, Another way, so, is like publications, and again, going along this through line is like knowledge that can be gathered from or with and around an artist or a work of art. And Hernan Bass is an artist who is based in Miami. And um, when I arrived, I had a conversation with Sylvia Carmen Cabinya, who's the executive director, and we just looked at a number of different artists who I was interested in working with and looked at her list. And Hernan is an artist who's based in Miami. He definitely has an international presence and a strong support of people who are interested in his work. And this is a series of paintings that he was working on that we decided to present, and they're called The Conceptualists. They're fictitious characters that he's come up with who each have a different kind of interest in making art, from like different pillow fights to working with water, working with self-portraits, to working with like water that's only gathered from the Niagara Falls. And it's very particular take on highly conceptual practices that are mostly, but not all, like a lot of painting practices. And his titles are really integral to these paintings. And so as conversations continued to happen with Hernan, we decided to present almost every painting from this series. I think we had 35 of the 37, including this very large studio portrait of a self-portrait that became kind of the piece de resistance at the end of the exhibition. And we worked with Hernan to design the large, I think this is almost like 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, as a kind of almost art fair scenario with these booths. So the design itself has kind of outline of what one might experience at the art fair. And being that the Miami Art Basel is such a kind of signature event in that region, some people may have recognized this. It also puts these different figures in conversation with each other that have been painted over a number of years, to the point even where they're facing the viewers as they come out. Here you can see they're all pointing into the aisle. And this was a very unique way of using the large gallery at the Bass. Typically, it's very large installations that might be even more time-based. There hasn't been such a concentration of painting in there, but we were really happy with the design of it. But one of the reasons I want to mention it is, Hernan had he'd had a book about 10 years ago that was produced by Rizzoli with some really incredible voices who had written critically about his work. But it was really important to me as a curator also of like how, so we have this exhibition that offers one way of, looking at his practice. And of course, it's limited by the time that it's up. And so it was very important also in this case to produce a book, a monograph on him. And I ended up making a partnership with Haje Kant and commissioning all new content and writing, including the great Isabel Gra, who's written so much and thought so much about painting, has an extensive conversation printed in this book conversation with Hernan printed in this book. Kevin Brazil writes, and Blake Oding situates his work in a longer legacy of conceptual practices. Kevin Brazil looked at his work within a kind of history of queer work, and then Liz Monsell looks at it in a history of like Latinx art. And I wrote about it in relation to a longer history of painting and juxtaposed it to like Courbet's a painting of the Allegory Artist Studio. And there's a lot to say about this, but it just also sort of dovetails in just the role that publications have for me as a curator, and also thinking about how they can kind of coalesce these curatorial ideas that may be, only they're hampered in a way by the time that an exhibition is up. Um, and I've got a few more minutes here to sort of to wind down, and we'll open it up to questions. As Stephen mentioned that we had launched the Tony Smith catalog raisonné last night at Pace, and it's a project that has been decades in the making. I have worked on it for the past 4 or 5 years. When I came in, the the here's the MIT Press. The project had been largely research, and components there, but not everything kind of given legibility. And as executive director of the Tony Smith Foundation, and also became editor of the Tony Smith Catalog Raisonné project with Sarah Auld, who's the director of the Tony Smith Estate. I approached MIT Press about publishing the Catalog Raisonné, and they had not produced a catalog raisonné to date, and it's something that, for those of you who know, they're very big projects and they're quite costly books. This book cost $240 on sculpture. And oops, I see a chat. Oh, sorry. Okay. And so what I wanted to do is how to contemporize or to reveal the ongoing vitality of Tony Smith, and to do that, I came up with the idea of the smaller books called Against Reason, Tony Smith and Other Modernisms, and we produced 2 of these books to accompany the architecture book and one to accompany the sculpture book. These have all newly commissioned writing by an incredible range of people working in a number of different disciplines: Mario Gooden, Christopher Ketchum, Marta Kuzma, Peter Lefficiau, Rebecca Quaitman, and Jasmine Rout for architecture. For sculpture, We have Judith Berry, Tom Burr, Jan Sheng Tane, Titleman, Simon Demerkan, Mario Gooden, and Jenny Sorkin. And this, as a curated endeavor, this is also like, and if we look at Tony Smith as a kind of archival object, what makes him and his work relevant? And these books were conceived as a way to, again, like arrive at Tony Smith from different points of view that animate the archive, essentially, that animate Tony Smith. And they're conceived as companion volumes to the larger volumes. These are $25. They'll radiate much further and than the catalog raisonné, but they will point to those books and the overall project. So I think a lot of my thinking then is like these curatorial methodologies that are like compositional in nature, and they're constellative, and each component sort of points at the major thing. In this case, Tony Smith, and other cases with the curating, it's the archival objects here with Rachel Feinstein and so forth, and Hernan Bass. So I think that might be a good place to like me to stop talking, and if there are some things in the chat, I can take a look at that.
Great. So thank you, James. So I'm not seeing any questions yet. Now, as I just wrote, is the time to do that. Let's give it a
Mm-hmm.
moment. I'll just start by asking you to talk a little bit more about, and for the general audience, for the roundtable as a course, I always ask that the guest give us a couple of things to read. And that term in what you gave us by you from the post-sensual aesthetics of the compositional keeps coming up, and it came up today. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on that notion because it rhymes in a sense with what you've just called the constellative. Um, can you talk us through that idea and the way that it figures into the, another way of putting it, the componential nature of the way that you think through a project? So there is the exhibition itself, and then you've gone through and talked about the different things that contribute to it as experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, the curatorial, the element of like the curatorial is and these are things that like you had Maria Len speak last night. She and Simon Shaika have talked about this, and these the that curating is gathering different aspects of a something, and putting like the writing and the thinking, the objects, the public programming together to arrive at art. And I think that the notion that just going to an exhibition, for example, of Caspar David Friedrich, which I saw yesterday when I was at the Met, on one hand, we have an aesthetic experience that can be transformative. And so you are standing before a painting, and you are able to look at the landscape. And that is sort of what we see as a kind of embodied visual, it's a central experience. The argument that I make in post-sensual aesthetics is that increasingly, and there are a number of different Whitney biennials recently, there are a number of our Documenta and Venice, like where reading and either inside the exhibition that is text that's produced by the artist that is meant to be integral to it, that also like is based on research that's happening like way, underground and outside of the exhibition context. That text becomes integral to the aesthetic experience, and then so therefore cognition is playing a part of the overall aesthetic experience. And so to trace the lineage too, and even with thinking as I started out talking with Tony Smith's sort of reservations about art, and that you just have to experience it. And experience is something that is based on time and space. And Robert Smithson in the Beyond Objecthood book is used a sample of that, because his works called Non-Sight were works that existed beyond the gallery. They were works that were in landscape. But what one experienced inside the gallery might be a photograph, it might be a sculpture, a slag, it could be his metal tins that held the slag from different mining things. So arriving at that work it was based on putting together the components that pointed to that, and that is also an embodied experience. But fast forward, if you have someone like Maria Eichhorn, who is looking at the restitution of Nazi looted art that primarily happens at a research institute, how does that research come about as an aesthetic experience? And it comes about by looking and reading and looking and thinking afterwards. So it extends the aesthetic experience beyond just the gallery to right now, like in the evenings, we could be sitting and looking at a book by Maria Eichhorn that is integral to what one might have seen years ago at Documenta. And I think that it's a different way of acknowledging. It's a way to acknowledge and sort of think more critically about the increasing incorporation of this archival and research-based material inside exhibitions.
How shall I put it? The kind of shift that happened with the last document, of course, with Ruin Grupa, was to expand the idea of the curatorial such that it became a community collective-based demonstration, so to speak, that there was another art world and another way of thinking about the experience of making, producing knowledge, sharing knowledge, collaboration, that I wouldn't say is entirely apart from the capitalist-based art world, but is alongside it, so to speak, dips in and out of it, depending on what's necessary in order to survive, really. And the way that it's interesting because the way that you're speaking about the notion of the constellative, um, at least the way you've said it so far, doesn't touch upon that. It talks about the notion of the thing, which is the exhibition. Um, but it doesn't, or you haven't addressed the political public side of things in that way. Does that figure into what you're thinking about?
I mean, I think for me, that edition of Documenta wasn't, it was difficult to understand the articulation of it. And I think that there were a number of different threads and voices speaking at the same time and almost equally. And I think that a constellation needs to, like, for me, I mean, I think going back to the Phil Collins learning site, I mean, it was pointing to a something, and it was different ways of arriving at the important questions that were political. And then that Phil Collins's practice asks. So, like, what does it mean to, or does it mean that people are being instrumentalized to sing karaoke to the Smiths as part of his practice? And I think that you can look critically at what an artist is doing in order to tease out those political questions that might be around the instrumentalization of people for an artwork and for participants for an artwork, and set up frameworks to have those discussions. But I think going back to your question is always like pointing to the thing, and the thing in that case is Phil Collins. And I think the constellation, for me, like, it's also just a way of organizing. It's a way of organizing thinking and getting at something, an idea, a concept, an artist work. And I loved that. Even, like, I'm teaching this fall at Hunter and stuff, and like we're going to look at Tony Smith. So what are all the different ways that we can arrive at the important questions that his practice asks, and the relevance of an artist like him today. And that's where you can't have everything speaking equally loud. And for me, that the Ruin Gruppa's edition of Documenta had a lot of things speaking loudly simultaneously, and it wasn't clear.
Hmm.
And so, I don't, I think that's that's what I could say about that.
Okay. All right. So I think we're going to end things. Thank you to the audience. And we'll join again, James, on the private link with the students.
Okay.
Great.
That's great.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
again. Oh, so great. Thanks again,
All
Stephen.
right.